The wind blew dry dust across the endless plains as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in streaks of gold and fire. Daniel Briggs, a lone cowboy with a weathered hat and a heart made soft by years of loss, tightened the reins of his horse and rode toward home, a small barn tucked between two silent hills. He had no one waiting for him there, no wife, no kin, just the old mare that kept him company and the memories of a family buried long ago in the red soil of Texas. That evening, as he passed near a dying creek, something caught his eye, movement, small and fragile, half hidden beneath a fallen log. He dismounted slowly, hand near his revolver, unsure whether it was an animal or something worse. Then he saw her, a child, no more than 7, skin pale with hunger, eyes sunken yet burning with fear and defiance. She was native, Apache by the look of her, and she clutched a bundle of dry grass as though it were food. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew the stories. Settlers were warned to stay clear of the tribes, especially now that tensions had risen again after a trader had been found dead near the river. But this wasn't a warrior. This was a starving child. Without thinking, Daniel dropped to his knees, his voice soft as he said, "Easy there, little one. Ain't no harm coming to you." She flinched, too weak to run. He offered her the last of his jerky and his canteen, watching as she devoured both like a creature that had forgotten what kindness tasted like. When she finished, she whispered a single word, "Nita." He smiled faintly. "Name's Daniel," he replied, tipping his hat. "You're safe now, Nita." He wrapped her in his coat and lifted her onto his horse. As they rode toward his barn, the sky grew dark and full of stars, the kind that seemed close enough to touch. Inside the barn, Daniel lit a lantern and built a small fire. He gave her warm milk from his cow and laid her on a bed of hay. She slept almost instantly, clutching his coat like a promise. Daniel sat there for hours, watching the flames dance, wondering what kind of man he would be if he turned her away. He remembered the winter when he lost his wife, Clara, to fever, how no one came to help him then. Maybe, he thought, kindness was like a circle, what you gave eventually came back around. By morning, Nita was stronger. She smiled shyly as Daniel made her breakfast, a rough plate of eggs and cornbread. For the first time in years, his barn felt alive again. Over the next day, she followed him everywhere, feeding the chickens, brushing the mare, even trying to help mend the fence. She didn't speak much, but her laughter was enough to fill the quiet spaces that grief had left behind. That evening, Daniel decided to take her to town to see the doctor, but as he saddled the horse, Nita grew terrified. She shook her head violently and pointed toward the hills. "No town," she cried in broken English. "They kill." Her eyes were full of memories too old for her age. Daniel froze. He didn't know what she had seen, but he knew fear when he saw it. He knelt beside her. "Then you stay here," he said gently. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you while I'm breathing." That night, as Daniel sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, he heard distant drums. Low, rhythmic, coming from beyond the ridge. His blood ran cold. He had heard those drums before, years ago, during the raids that burned whole settlements to ash. He glanced back at the barn, where Nita was asleep. "Lord help me," he muttered, loading his rifle. The sound grew louder. Horses. Many of them. Daniel stood, his heart pounding. The moonlight spilled over the hills, revealing shapes, riders, dozens, no, hundreds of them, forming a dark river of movement. He could see their feathers, their spears catching the moon's glare. The Apaches. Daniel's first thought was to hide Nita. He rushed into the barn, whispering urgently, "Nita, listen to me, you gotta stay quiet, you hear?" But before he could say more, she grabbed his hand and shook her head. "No hurt," she said softly, looking out the window toward the approaching riders. "They, my people." Daniel's throat went dry. He realized then what this meant. She hadn't been lost. She had escaped something, and now, her people were here, coming for her. He wanted to believe they'd be grateful, that they'd see he had helped her, but stories in the West rarely ended kindly when fear and mistrust ruled men's hearts. The thunder of hooves drew closer until the ground itself trembled. Daniel stepped outside, hands raised, his rifle slung behind him. The first rider stopped just 20 feet away, a tall man painted in red and black, his expression unreadable. He looked at Daniel, then passed him toward the barn. He barked a word Daniel didn't understand. Nita ran out, crying, "Papa." The warrior dismounted instantly and caught her in his arms. The sight softened Daniel's fear for a moment, until he noticed the others. Nearly 200 of them, forming a silent wall around his property, spears glinting, bows strung tight. Daniel swallowed hard. He felt the weight of every rumor he had ever heard about frontier vengeance. Then, the tall warrior, Nita's father, perhaps, approached. He spoke slowly, his accent thick but his English clear enough. "You, help my daughter." Daniel nodded. "She was hungry. I couldn't leave her." The man's eyes studied him for a long moment, then flicked to the child. Nita whispered something in Apache, and whatever it was made the warrior's eyes soften. He looked back at Daniel and said, "You good man. But many not good." He gestured toward the hills. "Soldiers, come soon. They think we take child from town. They kill anyone they see." Daniel's heart clenched. He remembered the drums, not a war cry, but a warning. He realized the soldiers must have seen smoke from his barn or tracks from his horse and thought he was hiding the enemy. "What do we do?" he asked. The warrior placed his hand over his chest. "We protect." Then he lifted his arm, and 200 warriors formed a semicircle around Daniel's barn, shields raised, spears grounded in the dirt. The scene was unreal. The same barn that once echoed with loneliness now stood as the line between war and peace. Moments later, Daniel heard another sound, the distant rumble of wagons, shouts, the clatter of metal. The U.S. cavalry was approaching. He looked at Nita's father, who nodded once. "We not fight if they not shoot." Daniel ran to the edge of the property, waving his arms as the soldiers came into view. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "They're not attacking." But the commander, a young lieutenant with too much pride and too little patience, raised his hand. "Stand aside, Briggs," he barked. "They've taken a white child." Daniel stepped forward, furious. "That child ain't white, she's Apache, and she was starving. I gave her food, that's all." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you protecting them?" Daniel's voice cracked as he said, "Because they're protecting me now." The air grew heavy, the kind that comes before a storm. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Nita stepped forward, holding Daniel's hand, her small voice trembling as she said, "He good man. No kill." The silence that followed was so deep it felt sacred. Even the horses seemed to bow their heads. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, but something in that child's eyes, something pure, broke through the armor of hate that had been built by years of blood. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. "Stand down," he ordered. The soldiers obeyed. The warriors relaxed their grip on their spears. The night exhaled. Nita turned to her father and spoke rapidly in Apache. He looked at Daniel and nodded. "You save one child. You save tribe heart." Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a necklace, beads in a small carved eagle, and placed it around Daniel's neck. "You friend now. You brother." As the first light of dawn spread across the plains, the 200 warriors mounted their horses and rode back toward the hills, the drums now soft and distant. Nita looked back one last time and waved. Daniel raised his hat. When the last of them disappeared beyond the horizon, he felt the weight of silence return, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was peace. He looked at the necklace in his hand and smiled faintly. "Guess kindness really does come back around," he murmured. The wind carried his words into the dawn, and somewhere beyond the hills, the Apache drums answered, not with war, but with gratitude. The sun had barely risen over the rolling hills when Daniel Briggs woke to the sound of quiet knocking on his cabin door. The night before still felt like a dream, 200 Apache warriors standing guard around his barn, the tension with the soldiers, and the little girl, Nita, safe once more in her father's arms. But as the soft light poured through the cracks in the wood, Daniel realized the events of that night had changed something deep in him. The loneliness that once clung to his soul like dust had begun to lift. When he opened the door, he found an old man standing there, one of the local settlers, Mr. Price, his face weathered from years under the sun. "Heard you had quite the company last night," Price said, leaning on his cane. "Whole town's talkin' 'bout it. Some say you made a deal with the devils." Daniel sighed, stepping aside. "Come in, Price. Ain't no devils here, just people trying to survive." Price hesitated, then entered, glancing around the small cabin. "Folks don't see it that way. They're scared. They think the Apaches will come back." Daniel looked out toward the barn, where the necklace of beads and eagle still hung from a nail, glinting in the morning light. "They will," he said quietly. "But not for war." That afternoon, Daniel saddled his horse and rode into town. As he passed by the general store, the townsfolk stared, some curious, some hostile. A group of ranchers whispered by the water trough, their faces tight with suspicion. When Daniel stepped into the saloon for supplies, the chatter stopped. The bartender, a tall man named Hal, crossed his arms. "You really feedin' them savages now, Briggs?" Daniel met his gaze calmly. "Fed a hungry child. Didn't think kindness had a race." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that carried more judgment than words. Then a young ranch hand spoke up from the corner. "You keep that up, you'll get us all killed. You don't know what them folks done to settlers before." Daniel turned, his voice low but steady. "And you don't know what we done to them, either." He paid for his supplies, tipped his hat, and walked out, leaving behind a silence heavy with guilt. That night, as the stars came out, Daniel sat on the porch, the wind whispering through the dry grass. He thought about Nita and her father, about how they had stood shoulder to shoulder to protect him from the soldiers. He had felt something then, a bond that crossed every line man had drawn. As he dozed off in his chair, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure was approaching through the darkness. Instinctively, he reached for his rifle, but stopped when he heard a familiar voice whisper, "Daniel." Nita stepped out of the shadows, wrapped in a blanket of soft deer hide. Behind her stood two warriors, silent and watchful. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Nita, what are you doing here?" The child smiled shyly. "Papa say, I come see friend." Daniel knelt beside her, heart full. "Well, I'll be damned. You rode all this way just to say hello." She nodded solemnly. "You help me, we help you." She reached into a small pouch and handed him a piece of painted leather, marked with the symbol of an eagle over a rising sun. "What's this?" he asked. "Gift," she said. "You friend of Apache now." Daniel didn't know what to say. The warriors behind her bowed their heads slightly, then disappeared into the night, leaving the child with him. Nita looked exhausted, and Daniel quickly led her inside, giving her milk and bread. As she ate, she spoke quietly about her people, how the tribe had been pushed deeper into the desert, how their hunting grounds were gone, how sickness had taken many. Daniel listened, his heart breaking with every word. "Ain't right," he said softly. "Nobody should have to live like that." Nita looked up at him with eyes too wise for her age. "Papa say world no fair. But some hearts, fair." The next morning, Daniel hitched up his wagon with bags of cornmeal, salt, and dried beans, nearly all he had left. He told himself it was just a small favor, but deep down he knew it was more. He was going to the Apache camp. As he rode through the valley, he could feel eyes on him, the kind that belonged to men who didn't trust easily. When he reached the riverbed, a line of warriors appeared, bows drawn. Nita jumped from the wagon and ran to them, shouting words in Apache. The tension eased, and a moment later, her father appeared. He approached Daniel, his expression unreadable. "You come alone," he said. Daniel nodded. "Brought food, thought maybe it could help." The warrior looked at the wagon, then back at him. Slowly, he extended his hand. "You brave man, foolish, but brave." Daniel chuckled. "I get that a lot." They brought him into the camp, a hidden valley ringed by cliffs and dotted with makeshift lodges. The people were thin, their eyes weary, but they greeted him with quiet respect. He helped unload the supplies, then sat by the fire as the elders gathered. One of them, an old woman with hair white as snow, touched his shoulder and said in halting English, "You bring food, but you bring more. You bring hope." Her words sank deep into him. That night, under a sky of endless stars, Daniel listened to the drums, not of war this time, but of celebration. Nita danced among the children, her laughter echoing through the canyon. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt he was exactly where he belonged. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. 3 days later, a cloud of dust rose from the south, riders, fast and armed. Daniel's heart sank when he recognized the uniforms. The cavalry had returned, led by the same lieutenant who had stood down before. This time, he looked angry, desperate to prove his strength. Daniel rode out to meet them. "Lieutenant, there's no fight here," he said. "These people are starving, not raiding." But the man sneered. "You've gone native, Briggs. You're harboring enemies of the state." Daniel's voice hardened. "They ain't your enemies. You just don't see 'em as people." The lieutenant raised his rifle. "Step aside." Before Daniel could speak, arrows whistled through the air, a warning shot, not an attack. The Apache warriors had taken their positions on the ridge, ready to defend their camp. Daniel rode between both sides, shouting, "Stop. You'll start a war that don't need to happen." But no one moved. The air crackled with tension. Then Nita appeared, standing on a rock, her small figure framed by the rising dust. She raised the same eagle symbol Daniel wore around his neck, and shouted in both tongues, "No fight. We family." Her voice trembled, but it carried across the canyon. Everyone froze. The lieutenant's face faltered as he stared at the child, the same child who had once been found starving in the wild. Daniel turned to him. "You shoot now, you'll be killing what's left of Mercy." The lieutenant hesitated, his hands shaking. Finally, he lowered his rifle. "I'll report this," he muttered, before signaling his men to fall back. When they were gone, Daniel slumped with relief. Nita ran to him, and he hugged her tightly, tears he hadn't shed in years spilling freely. The Apache chief approached once more, placing his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You save us again," he said quietly. "Why?" Daniel looked at Nita, then at the faces around him. "Because somebody's gotta break the cycle. Might as well start here." Over the next weeks, Daniel visited often. He taught the Apache men how to mend fences and use tools, while they taught him to track, to listen to the land, to read the sky. Slowly, word spread, first among ranchers, then traders, that the Apaches near Briggs's ranch were not raiders but allies. A few bold settlers even came to trade peacefully. The walls between them began to crack, one small act of trust at a time. One evening, Nita came running to Daniel's cabin, her hair flying in the wind. "Papa say big council," she said breathlessly. "You come." Daniel followed her to the valley, where hundreds of Apache stood in a circle under the full moon. The chief stepped forward, holding a carved staff. "We speak of peace," he said. "You, Daniel Briggs, helped us when we were dying. You fed our child, and you stood before guns. Now, we make promise." He struck the staff into the ground. "No Apache will harm your people. You are brother of our tribe." The crowd began to chant his name, their voices echoing through the canyon. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He looked down at Nita, who smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "See," she said softly, "world fair sometimes." Years passed, and the land slowly healed. The soldiers never returned. The settlers and the Apaches traded, hunted, and celebrated the seasons together. Daniel's ranch flourished again, his barn rebuilt with the help of both white men and warriors. He grew older, his hair turning silver, but his eyes stayed bright, the eyes of a man who had seen hate and chosen compassion instead. Nita grew into a strong young woman, a bridge between two worlds, speaking both tongues, teaching both sides that kindness was mightier than fear. One morning, long after the drums had gone silent, Daniel stood at the edge of his field, watching the sun rise over the same hills where it had all begun. The necklace with the eagle still hung around his neck. He touched it gently and whispered, "Guess you were right, little one. The world can be fair, if we make it so." From the valley below came the faint sound of laughter, children playing, Apache and settler alike, the sound of a new beginning born from an old act of grace. The wind carried the scent of sage and hope across the plains, and for the first time in history, the land felt like it belonged to everyone.